Our top story today, Israel's government and Hamas militant group have separately announced that they've agreed to a Qatar-mediated deal. Under the deal, Hamas will free dozens of Israeli hostages in exchange for a 4-day pause in the fighting in Gaza, as well as the release of dozens of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. Once implemented, the deal will be the biggest diplomatic breakthrough and the first major pause in the fighting since the war began. Let's take a look at how this deal is expected to be implemented. The proposed deal, it's been divided into two phases. Hamas is expected to free at least 50 Israeli women and children held in Gaza under the first phase of the deal. Meanwhile, Israel is expected to release about 150 Palestinian prisoners, mostly women and children, over the 4-day pause. Israel will allow around 308 trucks per day to enter Gaza from Egypt. More fuel will also reportedly be allowed in during the pause in fighting. Hamas could release dozens more women, children and elderly people under the second phase. This as the Israeli government said that it would extend the pause for every additional 10 hostages released. Now, in the next 24 hours, Israel is expected to make public the names of the Palestinian prisoners set to be released. This will be done so that Israeli citizens can appeal to court against their release. However, according to officials, Israel will not release Palestinian prisoners who've been convicted of killing Israelis. More than 240 people, including several Americans, were abducted during the 7th of October Hamas attacks. 4 hostages, including 2 Americans, have since been released. 1 has been rescued, 2 others were found dead. For more on this, we're now being joined by Dr. Malcolm Davis, who is joining us from Canberra. He's a senior analyst in defence strategy and capability from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
And now, Dr. Davis, both Israel and Hamas have agreed to the Qatar-mediated deal. How do you see the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinians progress going forward?
Well, look, I think probably there'll be a great deal of interest on the part of the Israelis to get those hostages back. So I think the deal will go ahead. It will go ahead rather hesitantly because obviously there's a lack of trust, quite understandably, on either side. And then you have the other aspect of this deal besides the hostage release, which is the 4-day ceasefire, as well as the influx of aid and fuel into Gaza. So it's a fairly complex, delicate balance, and a lot of things have to be coordinated moment to moment, but I think this deal will go ahead. The challenge, of course, is that once it's been and done, what happens then? Is additional pressure then put on the Israelis to have another 4-day ceasefire? I think that's quite likely, and it could then turn into a situation where suddenly Israel is confronted with pressure to end the war before it's even achieved its objectives.
In fact, I was going to come to that. But before that, I also want to ask you, Netanyahu has made it clear that the war on ground will still continue. So how do you see this multi-day pause and hostage release shape the course of the war on ground?
Well, during this 4-day period, yes, there will not be any combat operations in terms of the Israelis launching attacks, and we would hope that Hamas would honor that agreement as well. But I think what will happen is the Israeli Defense Forces will use this 4-day ceasefire to essentially gather intelligence on Hamas forces, their locations, watch their communications, because Hamas will certainly use this 4-day pause to resupply their forces. And so I think that assuming that the 4-day ceasefire ends and then the Israeli Defense Force goes back into the fight, it may be that Hamas is more vulnerable at that point. But as I said, Hamas may use this in terms of a political warfare aspect to try and impose a longer delay on that outcome.
Right now, sir, coming back to the point that you had made earlier, this is just the first phase. Do you think pause in the war will be a sigh of relief for the people in Gaza? And do you think there's hope for an all-out humanitarian truce going forward?
I think, there will be, now that this is going ahead, I think there will be additional pressure put on Israel to have another one of these arrangements to release more hostages, to have a longer ceasefire. Ultimately, the challenge for Israel is that if it refuses that pressure, if it rejects suggestions of additional ceasefires, then hostages remain in Hamas hands, a greater risk. and Israel continues to lose international support. But if it accepts that pressure, then the risk is that ultimately it turns into a general ceasefire with the Hamas leadership and fighting forces still largely intact. And at that point, Israel then would have to question whether it can achieve its goals in this war.
All right. Dr. Davis, thank you so much for joining us with your insights on this.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.